Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and in today's episode, I have a conversation with KJ Ramsey. We talk about how KJ's suffering has forced her to rely on other people for help. There are times when our suffering puts us on the floor, either literally or metaphorically. And in today's episode, KJ talks about the rather remarkable surprises that often take place when someone joins us on the floor. Thanks for listening. I hope you find today's conversation meaningful. I am here with KJ Ramsey. KJ, it is good to see you.
Good to see you.
Tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you spend your time doing.
I would say who I am is a little bit of an oddball and a recovering idealist. And what I spend my time doing is I am a writer and a therapist, and I try to make sense of the pain in our world and find beauty and joy in it.
So you have written 2 articles that I want to talk with you about. And the more recent article that you wrote is The Education I Never Signed Up For. What was that education?
So I think succinctly, the education I never signed up for was, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but the school of suffering. I would never have signed up for the way that my life has turned out. I really wouldn't have. Disease was not my choice, and it is no one's choice. But it is what my story has been. And so the education that I ended up receiving is the exposure of my wounds, but also the healing connection of them to others, and the ability to know Jesus in my suffering in a way that I wouldn't have known had I not gotten sick. I have an autoimmune disease called ankylosing spondylitis. I've had it for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years this winter. I got it when I was a junior in college and 20 years old. And it's an incurable degenerative disease that causes a lot of pain throughout my spine and other joints, fatigue, dizziness. Pretty much I haven't had a day without pain in 10 years.
It's a stunning sentence.
Yeah, it is.
And this is the kind of pain that's not a 1 or a 2 on the scale.
Yeah, and in fact, I hate the pain scale so much because it doesn't really do justice to the complexity of what I endure and the shifting nature of it, because I can go from a 2 on the pain scale to barely being able to walk in a matter of an hour. And that's confusing, and that's really hard to explain to medical professionals or just the people in my life.
Yeah. And so even in the midst of intense, at times overwhelming physical pain, there is a loneliness, a bass note of loneliness in the midst of it.
There is. It's interesting that so much of what I write about is community, but there is an essential aloneness to this kind of suffering. And I think, honestly, all of our suffering, there's an essential aloneness that you have to accept. You have to grapple with it in order then to find community.
The uncertainty of when the pain is going to spike sounds like another big part of this. Like you said, you can go from a 2 to not being able to walk in a matter of hours. To say this simply, that your day-to-day life requires a level of courage.
It does. And I think that's why I like to talk about courage so much, because it's essential to survive really difficult circumstances. And it's something that we don't just have. It's a virtue. It's something that we have to practice.
So I want to quote you to you for a minute, because there are some sentences in these articles that you're not only a great writer, but you're putting your finger on some things that are hard to name and that really cut right to the heart. And here's one of these sentences. Sickness has an inelegant way of reversing relationships. Where I had previously played the role of comforter, I found myself learning the harder role of recipient. Thank you for the confession. It's a harder role.
Oof, it is a harder role.
What do you mean by that?
So I think being a recipient of others' care is the harder role because it involves exposure. It involves vulnerability. When we're in pain, we experience it very quickly as suffering because it's a threat to our identity. It's a threat to our sense of self, and it's a threat to our safety. And so pain, and that's not just physical pain, that's any kind of pain, emotional, spiritual pain itself. It triggers the body's system of fight or flight. It puts you into fight or flight mode. And so you immediately feel like you need to protect yourself from exposure. And receiving others' care means you're exposed, and it means you might be hurt. So there comes the courage again, right? It takes courage to let people see you in a position of exposure.
And it takes courage to receive their care.
Yeah, because you're not only exposed, but then you don't know if they're really going to accept you this week. What will they think of you?
This week. I love that you added this week because it never goes away. The question of they were there for me last week, but now my pain is back and it's not any better than it was. It may even be worse. And when will they leave, essentially?
Oh, right. Of course. Yeah. I mean, I've been sick for 10 years and I still face that visceral, almost anticipation of rejection from others. It's not nearly as bad as it was at first, but in the right set of circumstances, triggered by the right things, feeling the right amount of vulnerable, I sure do feel the fear that people really aren't going to be there for me this time, and they're going to reject who I am and what I need.
We need to make the linkage, and you've already made it, between physical pain and emotional pain, because very few people have the level of physical pain for the duration that you have it. But many, many people bear a level of emotional pain at various times in their lives. And it is hard when we are confronted and sitting with that to receive care.
Completely.
Let's go with that first phrase, that sickness has an inelegant way of reversing relationships. And I would not to tweak your writing, but I would expand it as to say that need has an inelegant way of reversing relationships. And you're nodding your head, so I can tell that at some level you agree. Can you say some about the reversal?
Yeah, well, actually, I would also add maybe need and weakness. I think weakness is the thing that precipitates the need. And we all have weakness. We all have weakness. We're just most of us try to hide it. The reversal is because most of us are trying to hide our need and our weakness, often subconsciously. We're not monsters. We're just all scared because most of us are running around scared, hiding how weak we really are. We try to project that we are strong and that others need us. That feels safe to our souls and our bodies. But when weakness rears its head, when depression strikes, when anxiety makes you feel like you're going to crumble, when your body fails you, when cancer strikes again, you are faced with a level of weakness that you can't ignore. There comes a point at which you can't run away from your weakness anymore, and you have to let it be seen by someone. And it's perhaps one of the scariest experiences in the world.
It's well said. And we need to, since you and I are both neurobiology people, we just need to add a slight piece of information, which is that we now know that the portion of the brain that registers physical pain is identical to the portion of the brain that registers emotional pain. Your emotional pain is no less real than breaking an arm. And it needs to be said, because what you're talking about, the reversal of the relationship and our need, it applies as much to those of us that are in emotional anguish as it does to when we are in a place of physical pain and extremity.
Absolutely. I see people every day in my practice as a therapist, and I interact with people every day on social media who are weighed down by really society's rejection of emotional pain as real. And the dichotomy between our bodies and our minds. And I'm just so fed up with it. It breaks my heart. It breaks my heart because people, if they could know how much their pain matters and how big of a deal it is, even neurologically, physiologically, their emotional pain and their physical pain, they perhaps wouldn't have to hide it quite so much.
And would not dismiss it as readily.
And would not take so long to try to get help.
It reminds me of the word vulnerability. Vulnerability comes from the Latin verb vulnero, which means to wound. So vulnerability is the ability to be wounded. Sickness forces you to need others and therefore to become vulnerable because you do not know how they will receive you today. And your writing seems to come out of a wrestling with that place. So here's another, let me quote you again. Here's another part. I was ashamed of my vast needs, even as I realized I truly was inadequate to meet them on my own. So, again, thank you for the honest confession of the shame. Due to your overwhelming pain, your needs are indeed often vast. But I think that we can say that for so many, just being a human being, we tend to be ashamed of our needs, whether they're vast or not. Why do you think that's the case?
I think part of the curse that's on this earth is that we believed a lie originally, and then we've inherited it through our bodies, our genes, genetic structure, all of it, that we are supposed to be self-sufficient, that we're supposed to be more capable of being God than we are. So there's this like essential struggle in every human heart to be more than God ever intended us to be. If we think that we're supposed to be God, then we're gonna reject outright and subconsciously anything that reminds us that we're fragile.
Or frail. And it all brings us back to this word need, or our neediness, and more specifically, our need for another person's care and presence. I mean, there's just something strangely odd and frankly should be suspicious of any person who becomes a therapist, because therapists are there for others, right? But some of my, and not to minimize the good that we do, but frankly, I think some of my most glorious moments on this earth are when I risk receiving care from another.
Totally.
And your sickness has brings that issue up for you on a daily basis. Will you receive care?
Right. But I love how you put that. Some of your most glorious moments are receiving care. When we receive the care of someone else, it's like we're taking part of the divine dance that we were all made for, that we are actually united to the God of the universe.
What we're talking about is the Trinity. We're talking about what does it mean to be created in the image of a triune God, a God who at God's core is we, not I. And if we're created in the image of a we and not an I, then we are most fully human and most fully divine when we are receiving as well as offering care.
Amen.
And boy, is that agonizing and annoying, because who wants to receive care? There's something about it that connects us to some deep vulnerabilities in us and some deep fears. And yet, I like how you put it. It's how God intended for us to be as human beings. So I want to read a paragraph that's raw and then talk with you about it. And this is what you say. In the beginning months of the illness, I frequently could not sleep from pain. And after hours of no relief, I would cry from the excruciation. One suite mate, so this is college for you, a suite mate in particular would often find me awake in the middle of the night, weeping on the floor of our shared study room. Instead of turning the other way or quipping how early she had to get up for an exam, she would join me on the floor, massaging my aching hands as I sobbed into her chest. What was it like for you to have this strong, healthy woman get on the floor?
It's hard to even remember it. Not because I can't remember it. It's hard as in it's painful. And when I wrote that piece, I wept. It like started weeping in the middle of the coffee shop while writing. So I guess I start with how it feels now is it still feels exposing to have been that sick and been that weak. So fresh. It was so fresh. I mean, that was just weeks after starting to really lose my health. And I don't know if I really comprehended how big that was. I think I felt confused and ashamed, and mostly I felt desperate because I was just in so much agony. So much agony. I know I felt seen by her. And I know that to this day, she's a safe person in my life.
There is something about being joined by another on our floors that is holy.
Yeah. And that's why I wept when I wrote it. It's holy because it is the story of Jesus. It's the story of our God. He joined us here on the floor of this earth.
And that's where you go in the article. You go on to talk about the healing story of God, how this woman helped you receive the healing story of God. But it dawned on me when I was reading it. I mean, you're a lover of books. You're a writer. You've devoured texts about faith, about Jesus, about the healing story of God. Yet it was not to minimize the books, but those are not what you're writing about. They did not catapult your body into the healing story of God. It was this woman and the other people in your life that have joined you on the floor. And many people are willing to join us when we're standing strong and when we're conquering things. But who in our lives is willing to join us on the floor? And part of what I hear in the little that I have read of your writing is that when others have joined you on the floor, you have experienced something of Jesus.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to ask you to talk about it, but I also realize that there really are no words for it.
There aren't that many words for it, and then there are.
When someone is willing to join us on the floor, we experience the core of the Trinity. We experience something there's a Trinity thing happening there. There's me, there's my friend, and there's Jesus. There is a triune thing happening on the floor. Anytime there is one person offering care, another person receiving care.
Absolutely.
It's just holy.
It is. And we can taste the holiness of it when we position ourselves to be open to it.
I'm glad you went there. You just used a conditional phrase. So can you say some about if we open ourselves to another's care? Because it is one of the most unnatural things in the world for us as adults, which is stunning because for infants, it's just instinctual. You just reach, you reach you reach your hand up. You reach both hands up, looking for care.
Yep. Again, so many people are very weighed down by the care that they haven't received, in addition to the suffering they endure, the pain, the disorders, the losses. So they have become doubly burdened by disappointment and by the belief that no one really will care for them. So it's not worth trying. And I have deep empathy for that. And I also have fiery challenge for that, because for people of faith, we are actually united to the God that makes it possible for us to have faith that we can receive care and that it will go well and that it will give us healing. And that is what faith looks like. Faith looks like letting ourselves be little children and reach out for care in the needs that we can't meet on our own. And faith is the belief and the hope that making that choice is actually going to do something that our souls deeply need in order to be whole.
And I am assuming that someone that has experienced the level of pain that you have with the frequency with which you have experienced it, the other person in the room has not always met you well.
Mm-hmm.
So you are not a stranger to people not entering into your pain well at all. And that works against the hope of opening yourself tomorrow. How have you navigated the disappointment, which always wars against our hope that tomorrow it's worth the risk of letting someone see our weakness and our pain?
So this question brings a little bit of tears to my eyes, just because I know my own experience of disappointment and dismissal from people who should probably be a bit more sensitive and caring. And it just breaks my heart to know that scorn. It is a scorn, and it's actually a spot where we get to participate in another spot where we get to participate in the life of Jesus. I think the burden of sickness, the burden of disorders, the burden of our mental health, all these things, it can put us in a position of feeling so alone and so misunderstood. And then that is reinforced when we reach out with our needs and they aren't met very well by others. They're not responded to properly. And that, I think, often it hurts on multiple levels because it triggers our core wounds of the ways that we were not adequately received in our families of origin and by important people in our life. It reinforces this belief that we really are misunderstood and alone. But scorn. So there's a scorn to our suffering. There's a scorn to the shame of it all. The belief that we are not understood and that we are alone in the scorn of our pain and our suffering is actually a lie. Because Jesus, he bore that scorn too. And I think that really, really matters for then finding comfort when we are dismissed. If we can know that we're part of a bigger story where God himself took on a frail body and had to feel the pain of others' dismissal, then that changes how lonely we have to be when people don't respond to us. Because ultimately, if I'm really sick right now, Adam, and you say something that's really dismissive and minimizes my pain, it'll hurt. But I can remember that Jesus knows my pain. I can remember that he knows pain. And I don't have to be fully alone in that moment. And then that helps me regain strength so that I can try again.
We can make a simple sentence. Your suffering has resulted in a newfound intimacy with Jesus.
Yes, and I am not special.
It's well said.
That intimacy with Jesus is something that is the inheritance of every believer. And it's more accessible than we imagine.
You have made some choices in the midst of extreme physical pain that are uncommon. We could even say it this way. You have made some choices with regard to opening yourself to the presence and person of Jesus that, whether you have physical pain or not, are uncommon. Can we transition to your second and older article?
Yeah.
God made our brain to need others. You've got a sentence, and here's the sentence. My autoimmune disease continuously forces me into a position of vulnerability before others, allowing others to see the powerlessness I would rather keep hidden. In the exposure of learning to receive love in my most broken places, I have found the deepest joy. So it's a great sentence. In the exposure of learning to receive love in my most broken places, I have found the deepest joy. What do you mean? And I know we've touched on it, but we really can't talk about this long enough. What do you mean when you say learning to receive love in my most broken places?
I chose to use the word learning there because being able to receive love from others is something that we have to learn. It's not something that any of us really know how to do in a way. In a way, it's actually written into the very fiber of our being. And we're all just trying to come home to what's really in our bodies, and it's our truest capacity, but it takes practice to come home to that place of being able to give and receive. So learning to receive love has meant choosing to put myself in a position where I actually let people see my brokenness and respond to it, whether they're going to respond well or not, and then continue to let myself be seen, even in the shame of weeping or the shame of, and there's part of that piece, I think, where I talk about my friend that came over to my house, and my house, there were this is super embarrassing. There were literal times where I wasn't well enough to get off the couch to take my dog outside. So there was poop on the floor when she came. And that is humiliating. Humiliating. To be an adult and not be able to pick up after your own dog. Right? But that's where you learn. That's where you learn.
And in the piece, when your friend comes over, you say that she wordlessly comforted me by coexisting with my suffering. There is a wordless comfort that can happen when another person is truly present with us. So can we talk about the neurobiology of that for a bit?
Oh, yeah.
We're in the realm of mirror neurons and limbic resonance when we talk about the wordless comfort of another person when we are suffering.
Yeah. So even though you don't feel like you can feel sadness even for yourself, when you sit across from a person who has empathy for you and who is safe, your brain is actually responding to mine. Because of the way mirror neurons work, as I show sadness and sorrow for you, your brain is learning how to mimic that and emulate that and feel it. And so where we have been broken apart by the curse of shame in our world, we can actually learn how to feel again in ways that will heal us. And that happens in that interchange of a human looking at another human.
Yes. I'm glad you say the word looking, because it is in the wordless gaze, very often the gaze, the presence of another person, even when they're not saying a single word, that something is transmitted from one right hemisphere to the other. And it results in an integration in the other person's brain. And it's wonderful that the science has caught up to the scripture, because this isn't surprising theologically.
Yeah, that's why I love neurobiology, because it's like science is actually just explaining the nature of who God is and who he made us to be as relational beings. It's like, it's astounding. It's so mesmerizing. I love it.
I want to go back to others being with us or not being with us in our suffering, because you say in the article that suffering internalized, and by that I think you're meaning like when it's not shared, when it's just me. Suffering internalized is dark and heavy. Suffering shared engenders courage and hope. So there are times when we share our suffering, we let someone in, and for whatever reason, they're not able to or not willing to join us there. What's it been like for you, KJ, when you have vulnerably let someone in and he or she has not responded to you like your friend who was so willing to join you in your anguish? My guess is several medical professionals have fallen in this camp.
Oh, yes.
But let's just put that to the side for a minute. What about others? Well-intentioned, perhaps, people.
Yeah, there's been so many of those experiences that it's hard to even come up with specific memories off the bat. Not that that's what you're asking for, but I have a mountain of those experiences that, kind of lives inside my body somewhere and haunts me. And what is it like? I can say that it remains painful. That it's like one of the curses and the joys of suffering is that you are in a position to continue to be wounded, but then you're also in a position to continue to find healing and be loved. So being dismissed by someone, I put it in that phrase because it's like somebody is rejecting your person.
There are few things that simultaneously cause such shame and such a sense of powerlessness than when we reach for care and we're dismissed.
Right. And not to be an over-spiritualized, crazy person, but isn't that another Jesus moment? My God, why have you forsaken me? We have to, and we get to experience the disconnection, the real disconnection that currently exists between us and other human beings. And somehow in that moment, we are actually tasting the experience of Jesus on the cross. That's crazy. That's crazy. It doesn't feel good, but it's powerful and important. So yeah, it's a very painful part of existing.
Later in the article, you say, and I love how you put this, I learned to embrace my suffering as a provocative gift for others to begin receiving healing validation for their own pain. All right, let me say it again. I learned to embrace my suffering as a provocative gift for others to begin receiving healing validation for their own pain. So it's a provocative gift. It's as if your willingness to be vulnerable provoked others to connect to their pain. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is what I'm saying. I think that people like me who endure a lot of suffering on a daily basis are a visceral reminder to all the other humans that we really are all fragile and broken. And people don't want to be reminded of that. That's why it's provocative.
But it's also invitational. By being in your body, and by body I also mean your emotional pain. By being in your pain, you are inviting others, I'm tweaking your sentence, to begin receiving healing validation for their own pain. That's the provocation. It's a playful provocation, but it's an invitation of, hey, you've got pain too, and it matters, just like mine matters. And it's almost as if you're saying, what if you took your pain seriously, my friend?
Yeah, exactly. I've realized over and over again, as I have to put my pain out there just, to survive, that most people aren't taking their pain seriously, and they need to. It's holding us back from being fully human. It's holding us back from living with joy. And I really, truly believe that people in pain of all sorts are a gift to this world because it helps us be more human.
Let's talk about neurobiology again. Your article goes on to say that you talk about this field of interpersonal neurobiology, and you say it emphasizes the role of relationships on neural integration. And then you give your example of your friend's compassion for you impacting your brain, impacting your body, impacting your experience. So are you saying that a relationship with another human being can actually bring healing and organization to the neural structure of your brain?
100% am saying that, yes. And it is, relationship is what God from the very beginning of all creation has made for us to engage in, to be fully human and to share in his beautiful joy. And relationship in the very practical sense of sitting with each other, looking at each other, letting someone do your dishes, having sex, all of the things is what changes our brain and body's capacity to respond to human interaction, to God, to stress. It changes the flow of our brain to be more fully human.
The way you put it is, as we feel heard and received by others, mental function and overall well-being can improve. And we know this just from the neuroscience, that when another person hears us and sees us and receives us, there is a moment of meeting. And in that moment of meeting, the receiver's brain structure reorganizes, and the neurons that are previously not well connected actually connect to each other. There's nothing abstract about this. Being heard and seen and received changes the neural architecture of our brain. And another word for that is healing.
Yes, absolutely. And I would add that I believe that not only is the technical recipient's brain changing, but the giver's brain is changing too, because there is probably no real division between that giving and receiving like we think there is. I know that I change when I sit with my clients and I offer them empathy. It changes me.
One of the questions that I often ask podcast guests is, how has your posture toward the younger you changed over the years? And I realize that you are still a young woman, but you have a 20-year-old self that was hit, that was in a car accident, basically, and everything changed. How has your posture towards that younger woman in all of her feelings changed in 10 years?
My posture towards that younger woman has changed significantly. I have a lot more compassion for her. And I also have a lot more respect for her and what she's lived. Since that proverbial car accident and before. I think that 20-year-old didn't realize that she had already lived so much and she was carrying so much pain and that she already was beautiful. I think I feel a lot less angst towards that younger self and towards my still youngish self now than I did then, or maybe have along the way. Instead of feeling really perplexed by how different my circumstances have turned out in comparison to my peers, or why I'm a little bit more of a nerd than most of the people I know, or all the things that just make me feel like I'm too different and I should be ashamed of that. I no longer feel so much angst about it because I know that my story makes sense within the story of God. And because of that, I have a home and I belong and I matter and I'm seen by the God of the universe. And so there's a peace. There's just a peace and like a chill that I can offer myself, knowing, hey, this does in a sense make sense, and your story's not done, and that sees you.
It has been so good talking with you, KJ. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing some about your story. If people want to access more of your writing out there in the world, how can they do that?
Yeah, the best place for you to find my writing is kjramsey.com, RAMSEY.com. And I have a monthly newsletter that I send out about all of these themes. And I'm also on Instagram every single day, sharing lots of things about my life and about all the things we talk about today. So I try to be really honest and open there, and I really love engaging with readers there.
Thanks so much for listening to The Place We Find Ourselves. Music for the podcast was provided by Rick Wilson and Rob Mathis. Thank you both, gentlemen, very much for your musical talents. If you enjoyed today's episode and think someone else would also, please share it with them. See you next week.